Writers, After Hours. Billie Meredith radiates positivity whilst posing the big questions in her work. She has performed both music and poetry in the UK and across Europe for the BBC, Brighter Sounds and the RFK Human Rights Foundation. I asked Billie which came first, poetry or music.
So for me, it started with music. Both my parents are musicians, and as far as I was aware, it was always going to be music. And it wasn't until I was a teenager, I think, that I realised that poetry was also a thing, and essentially is acoustic music in the sense of it can be any sort of format. I always found that it wasn't as constrictive as kind of the forms of writing music. And then, 16, 17, I joined Young Identity and kind of made that venture into poetry. And it began where I would do both, so I'd still perform my music, but I found that with time and kind of the topics that I've been writing about, that poetry has just happened to be a more holistic format for kind of the themes and things like that. So I do find myself now doing far more poetry than music, which is why I consider myself retired from the music element, but definitely still thriving in the poetry.
Okay, yeah, for sure. And when you say you're retired, but do you still play? Does playing or creating music form part of how you create poetry? Is there some sort of like symbiosis there?
Yeah, it definitely still is. Even though poetry is my main practice, there's so much from music that you still take over in terms of structure, in terms of sound, resonance. All those things definitely still make their way into my poetry. Especially when it comes to kind of writing and form, I do find that I'm still using musical techniques to create the poetry. And so often things that start out as a song or that start out musically sometimes form themselves into poetry, when I find that perhaps poetry is the better form, even though it was originally meant to be a song.
Right, yeah. And how were you first introduced to poetry, and like which poet like stood out for you that kind of awakened?
I think my favourite genre of poetry before I realised it was poetry was musical comedy. Okay. I'm a huge kind of BBC Radio 4 fan. It was on in my house all the time. And you think about stand-up and comedians, that was always my favourite performance format. And my first kind of opening to music with other themes outside of kind of traditional ones was a poet and musician called Tim Minchin, who's a musical comedian who I think is absolutely brilliant. And that was when I was still quite a young teenager, and I'd never been moved in the way that his music was able to. Ironically, it being comedic, and even his comedic music, his more serious things that he's not as well known for, moved me far more than any sort of traditional music. And I found that he was able to tackle really serious, quite dark topics with a humour, and then that's only offset by his incredible musical talent. And I just thought it's just a really great format to kind of preach to people in a way that they are on side and kind of get a story across. So I think musical comedy, there's other musical talents that I know stuck with me that I grew up with. So your Tracy Chapmans, your Bob Dylans, that's kind of the house that I grew up in. So yeah, I think those were definitely kind of made me realise that poetry and the content of the music that you're making is just as important as the melodies itself.
Mm-hmm. And you approach quite difficult and serious topics yourself, identity, colonial history. How do you find like the bravery to do that? What are the challenges in writing about those topics?
I think with writing, I think it's having the humility to know that everything that you are about to say or will say has already been said. And I think delivery is a big part of it. I think being able to find humour in the ridiculousness of quite serious topics is really important. And I think it's just because I'm quite a bubbly person, even though I'm like very existential. I think I don't want to leave an audience like bereft and miserable when talking about really serious topics like the human condition and things like that. So I think delivery is a massive part of it. I think humour is a massive part of it, like I said. And making it lighthearted or everyday in a way that it doesn't have to be heavy, it doesn't have to be egregious. Like the things that affect me or people who look like me or share the same identity as I do, it's every day. It's a Tuesday. It doesn't have to be heavy. It doesn't have to have the 1,000 years behind it. I think being able to broach these things with a laugh and making the audience feel better about their circumstances, I think is always the best option, especially in poetry, which can be heavy so often. Yeah. Like on a lineup, I like to kind of be a break from that, I think.
Yeah, much needed like lightness, I think, especially in these times. Yeah. I'm interested in your perspective then, because you talked about everything's been said already, and yeah, you talked about the human condition, and I know that you refer to the mundanity of the human condition. So I'm interested how you kind of came to that perspective, and just like talk to me about that. I was just kind of took me aback a bit.
Go into my mind's eye. I think being a human is ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's difficult. I think the idea that we're aware of our own awareness is like unfathomable and difficult. And I say that as someone who's very privileged and has a roof and hot water. And if I find myself struggling with the idea of existing, then I can only imagine people who have less than me feel. And I feel like we don't often poke fun enough at the fact that we're here and the fact that our brain is so impossible to understand that people struggle with really important things like mental health. And like I've mentioned earlier, existentialism, like it's insane. It's insane. And I feel like people aren't aware of it enough, and in the same time are very self-serious. And I think that the second that you realise that everything and nothing matters is the second that you can just forgive yourself for being absolutely insane. Because I think it's a very natural response to being a human person who has to interact with human people and make a life and grow babies and legacies and all those things. I think these really huge topics that are so self-important and consume our lives, I think the sooner that we realise that it's ridiculous to be here and to be aware of all of the things and get up and put your trousers on one leg at a time, I think that is really humbling. And I think it stops the spiral, definitely, to just understand that every insane thought that you've ever had is in some way valid, because none of us know what we're doing here. So you might as well enjoy the time that you do have and not take yourself so seriously, because every thought that you've had or every crisis that you're having has been had, and they have either found a solution or carried on. And yeah, I think it's just perspective is a massive thing. And I think poetry is a really good vehicle for perspective, because people go away and take those themes and kind of think about things differently. And I know that I consume poetry that way, so I can only hope that I do that for the people as well.
A manic intellectual, pickled alive but bored of living. All blues, little grass, too alone to be mad anymore, wrapped in ash, wrapped in ego, wrapped in grief. Manifestos of a Marxist. No more Iliad can save you, old man, and yet you still read. All you do is read. My unfortunate functioning.
You responded to the second part of my question, which was going to be how do you stay motivated if you have that like awareness of the absurdity? But you said, kind of finding the enjoyment and I suppose like, maybe the beauty as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's so much beauty in the chaos of it all. I think the fact that you wake up and make a series of decisions every day, I think that's a really beautiful thing. I think, and I'm not particularly religious, but people who believe in fate and all those things, I think that's really beautiful. I'm open to all the kind of little things that humans create to kind of help themselves make sense of the world around them. And I think it's a really beautiful thing. And I think for me, in terms of motivation, I work a lot with young people. And I found that really like keeps me going, because kids are brilliant. They're brilliant because they're not like saddled with all the seriousness of adults and the world is their oyster and they're all bright-eyed. And I think that every time I teach or I come away after a class with young people teaching them poetry, I just think their brains are brilliant. And I think the more that we can kind of tap into that childlike, before the worries kicked in type of energy, I feel like, it is really, really motivating working with young people when you are as large-brained.
Lovely. I mean, do you, when you're teaching young people or engaging with them with poetry, are you bringing in those big ideas? Okay.
Massively. I found that a few years ago I worked as a rapporteur for the Ripples of Hope Festival, which was with the RFK Foundation. It was a human rights conference that took place in Manchester. And a part of that project was we went into schools and spoke to kids about human rights, essentially. And it was like primary school age, I think it was like 11, 12. And it was a brilliant, like, long project, which was like a series of classes. And it was just the concept of like having to speak to like 8, 9, 10 about like the Geneva Convention and like what are their human rights. They have rights to education, they have rights to, and I think during that project I found that kids, if anything, know the most about what it means to be like a human person. And it was really wonderful to be able to speak to young people about the human condition, which to them, when you're 8 or 9, it's like, what is it to be a human? It's to share my cheese sticks with my friend at break. I'm like, perfect. It truly is. Whether you're 3 or 30, I feel like that really is the human condition. And it was just really enjoyable to speak to them about really heavy themes, but because of their age, they approach things with such a pureness and positivity that they really are able to grasp these huge concepts without much help. And I feel like because they're young, we usually like infantilize kids, but more than anything, they know exactly what's going on and they know exactly how to process their awareness because they're always learning. So I think after that project, I do find that those themes, in terms of who you are as a person, what it means to be a human, kind of all the peripheral about it, I do bring a lot into my classrooms because I think it's really important at that age when you're kind of discovering and learning like what's important to you, what makes you you, and how that changes, and kind of looking at young people's sense of self and kind of using poetry for them to kind of discover that. And especially that age when they're thinking about what they want to be and what they want to do and the changes they want to make, it is a really, really great marriage in terms of the themes in that age group, definitely.
Amazing. So it sounds like you gain a lot from working with different age groups and in different like settings. How is it for you working like interculturally? I know you've done some work abroad in like Berlin. You've done something in Denmark or with Danish people. How was that experience? How has that sort of fed your creativity or kind of helped you with these thoughts?
I think it's been really, really refreshing getting to do sort of cultural exchange programs with other artists, and I think it helps you kind of step outside of yourself and the framework that you understand as music and poetry. So most recently, as you mentioned, we did a collaboration with 2 festivals in Denmark, and part of that was we went back and forth to Denmark, and we had a group of Danish artists that came to Manchester, and we wrote collectively together about our cities, which was Manchester, Aalborg, Aarhus. And there were 2 poets from each. And I found that in Denmark, which is still Europe and really an hour on the plane, their idea of not only poetry, but kind of music and their culture and their pop references is so vastly different as it would be. It's an entirely different country, that I found myself really learning a lot about how I approach not only music, but kind of just performance art in general. So, for example, in Manchester here, we have a really thriving poetry scene and poetry performance scene. So we have like slam nights, we have poets who are kind of something of celebrity. Whereas in Denmark, it was a lot more niche still, and it was really traditional. So your poetry readings were still read maybe in a chair by a mic. It was still very like verbose and just really lovely in its own way. And that kind of clash of cultures, I remember me and my fellow poet, Saf S2E, who's also a producer and an artist, we were trying to explain to them like the Manchester scene and how like a lot of performance elements are used. Like if a poet used pyrotechnics here, you wouldn't really blink an eye because it's like just anything goes. I remember trying to explain it to them and they were like, no, that's not. So it's really interesting. And then also kind of looking at poetry in terms of how it's used here. So we have a lot of poetry that's used in advertising. You look at Nationwide, you look at UEFA. It's really a big deal. There's a lot of poetry that's kind of broken into the mainstream. We've got George the Poet, and even a lot of grime artists now who are considered poets, Mustafa and things like that. Whereas for them, poetry really is its own lane, and it's insane to them to consider that poetry would ever be, what's the word? That poetry would ever be like mainstream or egotistical, or like, how dare you do cartwheels while doing poetry? It's supposed to be serious and somber and very internal. It's almost like, yeah, so that was really interesting. I definitely took that back in my practice. And I was like, maybe poetry is just supposed to be poetry. I'm not supposed to be selling it or, you know, making big things. So I remember me and Saf came away just really respecting kind of the craft at its core. Again, being around poets who are true artists first and performers afterwards. Whereas I find that in our line of work, we were performers first and poets afterward. So I think, yeah, culturally it is incredibly helpful to surround yourself with poets with different backgrounds and different like beliefs in terms of how the art form should be performed.
That's really interesting. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, yeah, connections. I think the more connections we have, the more insights we have. It'll only help us grow and like obviously learn along the way. But yeah, on that sort of like idea, I was quite curious because as I was preparing for today very thoroughly, I didn't find you on social media or anything like that. So is that like a sort of active decision you've made? And if so, do you mind talking about it?
Yeah. So it's true I'm not on any sort of socials, which is criminal as someone who is a performer and supposed to share their work and have access to their work. And for a lot of time I had socials because I realised that it was part of the job and it was mandatory, and if you're on a gig or a lineup they need to be able to tag you and all of those things. So I've had it against my better judgment or my own will for quite a while, and then I think toward the end of last year I just kind of bit the bullet and just thought it's not productive for me. And I don't mean that in like these kids live the internet way, not at all. I just think that there's so much happening in the real world, and I think that if I perform live anyway a lot of the time within my collective, so I'm happy to just exist as a live experience, if that makes sense. I'm just happy to exist in real time.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lot. it's a lot better. And I think it's easy to get kind of sucked into kind of everything that's going online, and then you realise that you close the app and it stops existing. So why not just, it feels like so real. And I think it just got a bit too much, and I was like, there's nothing on here for me. But I have found in the opposite way how much you miss out on. So in terms of like, there's been a lot of protests going on and things like that in the city every single week, every Saturday. Had no idea till a friend told me. So it is really weird going back to kind of like pigeon mail and like organic ways of finding out like really important things and things like that. I come back to reading the newspaper and I'm like, is this my only option without social media? So it definitely has its pros. Yeah, I think I'm just happy to be kind of a live experience. I've never really liked pictures or like being captured in that way. So it's a lot healthier for me, I feel like, to just wake up and take it day by day and then forget about it when I go to sleep.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Billie. And I'm sure we'll see you on a lineup soon in Greater Manchester. But yeah, any final words?
No, just thank you for having me. I think it's really lovely kind of looking at this intersection between kind of performance art and how it blends with music and poetry. You can't find me anywhere, but I do work with Young Identity as a collective. So any sort of work, any lineups, if you are looking for kind of my work and my mutuals, then you can find us at Young Identity on all socials, and you can seek me out there. On the motor road with a Hollywood smile, strip a booty in a rat like wow, brain like Berkeley, met her at Coachella. I went to see Chica, she went to see Z-Trip. Perfect. I took a seat on the ice cold glow, and she handed me an ice blue bomb, whatever. She said she wanted to be a tennis really bad. She's in school paying for tuition, doing porn badly. At least you're working, well girl, I can't feel my face. What are you smoking anyway? She said don't let the high go to waste. Can you taste a little taste of Novocaine, baby?
Here's this episode's writing prompt. As you walk around absent-mindedly one day doing the usual, people start to give you strange looks and tiptoe around you. Describe the rest of your day. This is a Culture Word production. Thank you to our funders, The Space and Arts Council England. Recorded at Silver Lining Music Studio.